Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. I'm so glad to have you with me here today. In my last video, I offered to do a video delving into the Victorian conception of the lost land of Atlantis. Little did I know when I made that offer what a massive undertaking it would be. This is going to end up being a two-part video, the first part covering Atlantis, and then the second part covering some other ancillary lost continents that are related to Atlantis but are different. But before we get into the philosophies, legends, and quite frankly cracked theories that inspired the Victorian Atlantis, we need to go back in time a little bit to get some context. Before we get started, I'd like to remind you to subscribe to this channel, turn on the little bell thing so you can get notified of future uploads, like this video, leave a comment underneath, and follow me on Instagram. It's free. So there's a link to my Instagram in the description. There's also a link to my email if you need to contact me for whatever reason. Now let's jump into it. The first known writing to mention the fabled lost continent of Atlantis was penned by Plato in roughly 360 BC. Plato's writing takes the form of a dialogue between two philosophers, Critias and Socrates. In the writing, Critias tells Socrates the story of the fabled lost city of Atlantis, which Critias says he learned from his grandfather, who supposedly learned it in Egypt. Plato places Atlantis in the Atlantic Ocean, beyond the Pillars of Hercules, or what we today call the Straits of Gibraltar. He says that it existed around 9,000 years before his time, or roughly 11,500 years before our time today. Plato tells the reader that Atlantis was the original seat of the god Poseidon, when the gods divided the world after they defeated their father Kronos. A majority of the island is said to have consisted of a very fertile plain. It contained every type of animal, with special attention being paid to the elephants that lived there. In addition to every animal, every fragrant thing on Earth thrived there, as did every fruit and vegetable. Near the plain, in the center of the island, lived a woman named Cleito, I think, C-L-E-I-T-O. Poseidon loved her, and so he, quote, broke the ground and enclosed the hill in which she dwelt all round, making alternate zones of sea and land, larger and smaller, encircling one another. There were 2 of land and 3 of water, which he turned as with a lathe out of the center of the island, equivalent in every way. So basically, he created a bullseye. Land, water, etc. On the central island of the bullseye, Cleito lived, and Poseidon caused to spring forth from the earth both a hot spring and a cold spring, in addition to every type of food imaginable. Poseidon begat 10 sons by Cleito, and he divided Atlantis up into 10 sections, making each son king of one section. The king of the central bullseye was high king above all the others. Now, it goes without saying that Atlantis was very rich in natural resources. Gold, silver, copper, tin, and orichalcum. Orichalcum is a metal that is mentioned in several writings from around this time. It also shows up in the Aeneid, for instance. And in the Atlantis story, Plato tells us that in Atlantis, orichalcum was considered to be the most precious of metals with the exception of gold. In spite of this relatively decent documentation from the time, it's quite difficult to determine what orichalcum actually was. And this task is made even more difficult by the fact that the name of orichalcum has been applied to several different types of metals and alloys since Plato's time. For example, today, the name orichalcum is applied to a type of brass alloy created by the Romans to make their coins. But the Roman orichalcum cannot be the same as the Atlantean orichalcum, because in the Atlantis story, Plato tells us that orichalcum is now only a name, and brass and alloys of brass existed in Plato's time. So if orichalcum as it existed in Atlantis no longer existed when Plato was writing, then he must have been referring to something else. These ingots that you see on your screen now were discovered in 2015. They have also been called orichalcum. When tested, they were found to be an alloy of 75 to 80% copper, 15 to 20% zinc, and then trace amounts of nickel, lead, and iron. But all of these materials also existed in Plato's time, so it's unlikely that this is what he was referring to, for the same reason that the Roman brass can't be what he was referring to when he said orichalcum. Some people have suggested that Plato's use of the word orichalcum referred to a certain type of alloy that was lost by his time. People had forgotten how to make it. However, sources contemporary to Plato mention orichalcum being mined, which implies that it was not an alloy, since you can't just go and mine an alloy. You mine the ingredients of an alloy, and then there has to be human intervention to make an alloy. So because orichalcum can be mined, it doesn't seem likely that it's an alloy. In the Aeneid, orichalcum is described as being white. Somebody's breastplate is described as flashing with white orichalc. And that has led some people to speculate that perhaps it's platinum, and it wasn't actually lost by Plato's day, but it's so rare that they hadn't been found for a long time. But that seems unlikely for two reasons. First of all, it's way more common on Atlantis than platinum is anywhere in the world, and you may think that he's just exaggerating to make it seem extra wealthy, but gold does not show up nearly as much on Atlantis as orichalcum does, so that makes me think he's probably not exaggerating, because if he were exaggerating, then why wouldn't he use gold? Because even by Plato's admission, gold is more valuable to the Atlanteans than orichalcum. Secondly, and I think more convincingly, in the Atlantis story, Plato describes orichalcum as flashing with red light. This makes it unlikely to be platinum. This here is my great-grandmother's wedding ring. It is platinum, and I think only a blind man could describe it as flashing with red light. Put this back on. Pseudo-Aristotle, in De Mirabilis Auscultationibus, or Of Wonderful Things Heard, writes of a type of copper that is, quote, very shiny and white, not because there is tin mixed with it, but because some type of earth, people have speculated that this type of earth could be cadmium, some type of earth is combined and molten with it. And some people think that this could be a potential explanation for orichalcum. Still, other people think that orichalcum is a purely fictional metal. I disagree. Because it is mentioned in disparate and distinct works of literature from this time, that makes me think that it was based on some real type of metal. Probably a forgotten alloy. I know I said it's not likely to be an alloy because you can mine it, but maybe references to mining orichalcum are references to mining the pieces that are required to make the orichalcum alloy, and the alloy has been forgotten, or had been forgotten by the time Plato was writing. Who knows? But whatever orichalcum was, Atlantis had loads of it. The people of Atlantis built bridges over the water zones of the central bullseye, and then on the central island of that bullseye, they erected a temple to Poseidon. Every successive generation would add to that temple, each one trying to outdo the generation that had come before, until it had become, quote, a marvel to behold for its size and beauty. The banks of all of the land zones were raised up very high, and the land was covered with buildings, temples, amphitheaters, chariot tracks, you name it. To connect the outermost water zone of the bullseye to the sea, they, quote, dug a canal 300 feet in width, 100 feet in depth, and 50 stadia in length. When this was done, the outermost zone of the bullseye was used as a harbor. Each of the three land zones were surrounded by a wall. The outermost wall was covered in brass, the middle wall was covered in tin, and then the innermost wall was covered in orichalcum. Plato speaks at length about the luxuriousness and the wealth of Atlantis. I'm not going to get into that here. If you want to hear the story, you can read it yourself. It's not a long story. Just suffice to say, Atlantis was a very wealthy and luxurious place to live. Not only was Atlantis a very wealthy society in the material sense of the word, but it was also a very virtuous society. The Atlantean people were pious. They kept the laws of the gods, and they cared not at all for their masses of worldly riches, which makes me wonder why they tried to acquire them if they didn't care about them. But eventually, I quote, human nature got the upper hand, then, they being unable to bear their fortune, became unseemly, and to him who had an eye to see it, they began to appear base, and had lost the fairest of their precious gifts. But to those who had no eye to see the true happiness, they still appeared glorious and blessed in the very time that they were filled with unrighteous avarice and power. Zeus, the god of gods, who rules with the law and is able to see into such things, perceiving that an honorable race was in the most wretched state, and wanting to inflict punishment on them, that they might be chastened and improved, collected the gods into his most holy habitation, which, being placed in the center of the world, sees all things that partake in generation. And when he had called them together, he spake as follows. And here Plato's text abruptly ends. It is believed that he died before completing it. Now, it's interesting that Plato's story actually does not include the destruction of Atlantis. It's mentioned earlier in the dialogue between Critias and Socrates that Atlantis was destroyed and sank below the waves, but the story never actually gets to that point. So the most famous part of the Atlantis story isn't actually even in the story. Plato's contemporaries, and people who came just after, were divided in opinion as to whether or not Atlantis was real. Aristotle thought that Plato had invented Atlantis in order to teach philosophy, while Crantor seems to have thought that it was real, although there is a little bit of debate about his opinion as to the veracity of the Atlantis story, but generally people agree that he seems to have thought that it was real. After the classical period, interest in Atlantis seems to have waned pretty dramatically. It pops up every once in a while, but for the most part, it is really not very much talked about in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance and the Baroque period. Athanasius Kircher, remember from last time? Watch my last video, because he cropped up in that. Like I said before, this is all related. Athanasius Kircher did think that Atlantis was a real place. Sir Francis Bacon's posthumously published work, A New Atlantis, is a utopian novel portraying an aspirational depiction of the future of human knowledge and discovery. The fact that Atlantis, in the 1620s when this book was published, seems to have been a shorthand for a utopian world tells us that even though it wasn't incredibly well known, there was a conception of Atlantis among the educated elite at this time, and it did have this sort of connotation of being a utopian place, a connotation that it still has to this day. But aside from those few examples, Atlantis really was not a part of the public consciousness until around the 1850s. And this brings us to Victorian Atlantis. In the mid-19th century, there was a craze for all things Mesoamerican. There were numerous scientific expeditions taking place in Mesoamerica, and the explorers made archaeological discoveries that enchanted the world. One of these explorers was the Abbé Charles-Étienne Brasseur de Bourbourg. He traveled extensively in Mesoamerica in the mid-1800s and achieved relative fame for his translation of the Popol Vuh, which is a sacred text of the Quiché Maya people. In 1866, he published Grammaire de la langue quiché, in which he speculated that Atlantis actually did exist, and that it had achieved an advanced degree of civilization long before the civilizations of Europe and Asia had begun. He drew connections between Europe and Asia and Mesoamerica by suggesting that several European and Persian words could be traced to the indigenous languages of the Americas. He also suggested that in ancient times, the New and Old Worlds had been in constant communication with each other. In 1866, the Abbé de Bourbourg published Monument ancien de Mexique, Palenque et autres ruines de l'ancienne civilisation de Mexique, or Ancient Monuments of Mexico, Palenque, and other ancient ruins of the Mexican civilization. For the purposes of this video, what is important about this book is not the writing, but the illustrations, which were done by a man named Jean-Frédéric Valdec. Although his illustrations were done with actual first-hand knowledge, he spuriously implied a close relationship between Mayan art and architecture and the art and architecture of classical antiquity. This fueled speculation about contact between the two cultures, facilitated, of course, by Atlantis. In 1868, the Abbé de Bourbourg published Quatre lettres sur le Mexique, or 4 letters about Mexico. In this book, he drew parallels between Mayan and Egyptian pantheons and cosmologies, and suggested that they all had a common origin on Atlantis. About 20 years later, the Abbé de Bourbourg's writings would inspire an American politician to write the book that would really light the fire of Atlantis onto the world. In 1882, Ignatius Donnelly wrote Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, and in this book he sought to prove 13 things. I am just going to read off from the book what he wanted to prove. This book is an attempt to demonstrate several distinct and novel properties. These are: 1. That there once existed in the Atlantic Ocean, opposite the mouth of the Mediterranean Sea, a large island which was the remnant of an Atlantic continent known to the ancient world as Atlantis. That the description of this island given by Plato is not, as has long been supposed, fable, but veritable history. That Atlantis was the region where men first rose from a state of barbarism to civilization. That it became, in the course of ages, a populous and mighty nation, from whose overflowings the shores of the Gulf of Mexico, it's still called the Gulf of Mexico, you know, the Mississippi River, the Amazon, the Pacific coast of South America, the Mediterranean, the west coast of Europe and Africa, the Baltic Sea, the Black Sea, and the Caspian were populated by civilized nations. That it was the true antediluvian world, the Garden of Eden, the Gardens of Hesperides, the Elysian Fields, the Gardens of Alcinous, the Mesomphalos, the Olympus, the Asgard, of the traditions of ancient nations, representing a universal memory of a great land where early mankind dwelt for ages in peace and happiness. That the gods and goddesses of the ancient Greeks, Phoenicians, Hindus, and Scandinavians were simply kings and queens and heroes of Atlantis, and that the acts attributed to them in mythology are a confused recollection of real historical events. That the mythology of Egypt and Peru represented the original religion of Atlantis, which was sun worship. That the oldest colony formed by the Atlanteans was probably in Egypt, whose civilization was a reproduction of that of the Atlantic island. That implements of the Bronze Age of Europe were derived from Atlantis. The Atlanteans were also the first manufacturers of iron. That the Phoenician alphabet, parent of the European alphabets, was derived from the Atlantean alphabet, which was also conveyed from Atlantis to the Mayas of Central America. that Atlantis was the original seat of the Aryan or Indo-European family of nations, as well as of the Semitic peoples, and possibly also of the Tutarian races. That Atlantis perished in a terrible convulsion of nature, in which the whole island sank beneath the ocean with nearly all of its inhabitants, and lastly, that a few persons escaped in ships and on rafts, and carried to the nations east and west the tidings of the appalling catastrophe, which has survived to our own time in the flood and deluge legends of the different nations of the New and Old worlds. Now, those are some pretty bold claims if you ask me. I'm not going to go through every single claim and example that he makes in this book. It's 490 pages long, and if I were to thoroughly deconstruct this book, this video would be approximately unending. But I have read this book, and to his credit, Donnelly does include many examples to prove his points. He also, interestingly, quotes extensively from the Abbé de Bourbourg. Now, some of Donnelly's examples are more convincing than others. For instance, he draws connections between corresponding myths and religious practices in the New and Old worlds, cultures that really should have no knowledge of each other and yet somehow have very similar religious practices. At the very least, that's interesting, and it does make one think. But a lot of his examples are significantly less convincing. For example, he speaks with great excitement about how the arrowheads of Neolithic Europe look remarkably similar to the arrowheads of the Neolithic Americas. This is significantly less convincing, as there are only so many forms that an arrowhead can take and still remain a functional arrowhead, and a lot of Donnelly's points fall more into the arrowhead category than into the corresponding religious practices category, but it's still an interesting read. I'll get more into what I think of it later on, but it is from this book that our modern perceptions of Atlantis largely stem, not from Plato. It's from this book. This is the book that suggests that Atlantis was a highly advanced civilization and they had a massive empire. You know, the whole Disney Atlantis thing? By the way, that movie's supposed to take place in 1914 and the costumes are not great, but that whole idea comes from this book in 1882. But how many people of the time actually believed in Atlantis? Well, we can in a way answer that question by looking again at the Abbé de Bourbourg. His reputation was pretty much shot because he clung so stubbornly to his Atlantean theories. The way he saw it, the Mayan Empire had originated from a people called the Toltecs, and these Toltecs had come from Atlantis. However, not everybody else saw it that way. In 1875, an academic wrote that not one single scholar accepted the Abbé de Bourbourg's theories about Atlantis. Now, interestingly, the Toltecs were a real people, but they did not come from Atlantis, and the Maya did not come from the Toltecs. The Mayan Empire began around 3,000 years before the Toltec Empire began, and the Mayan Empire ended about 500 years after the Toltec Empire ended. The word Toltec refers to the group of people who lived at Tula, present-day Hidalgo in Mexico, and more broadly to a general kind of sphere of cultural influence that these people had. The Toltec Empire was relatively short-lived. It existed for 500 years, which is a long time, but compared to the 4,000-year-long Mayan Empire, it's a drop in the bucket. And it was really only at its height of strength for about 200 of those years. It was really building up for the first part and then in decline for much of the latter part, so it was really only about 200 years when the Toltec Empire was actually powerful. The Abbé de Bourbourg connected the Toltecs with the Maya, and although modern scholars are somewhat puzzled by some architectural similarities between Tula and the Mayan site of Chichen Itza, there is actually a much stronger connection between the Toltecs and the Aztecs. Now, I'm going to get into a little bit of Mesoamerican history here. You may feel like it's not pertinent to this video, but I spent a full day researching it, and I'm not going to let that research go to waste, so sit back and enjoy. The Aztecs considered the Toltecs to be their intellectual and cultural forefathers, and they considered Toltec culture as being the height of civilization. In fact, the Nahuatl word for artisan, Toltecatl, is derived from the word Toltec. Aztec oral tradition does contain a history of the Toltec Empire, but modern scholars are divided as to whether or not these histories should be accepted as actual history or whether they're purely embellishment, although all scholars do agree that there is a large mythical element to the narrative, even if they are accepting them as being more historical. So therefore, relatively little is known about the Toltec Empire, and much of what is known is subject to controversy and academic skepticism. But we do know that the Toltec Empire likely developed out of a mixture of the Nonoalca peoples from the southern Gulf Coast and the Chichimeca people from the north, and that for some unknown reason, the empire was in decline in the mid-12th century AD. The death blow to the Toltec Empire came in around 1150 AD, when Tula Grande, their capital, was sacked by the Mexica people who would later go on to become the Aztec Empire. Long story short, the Toltecs were real, but they did not come from Atlantis, and nobody in the 19th century thought they did come from Atlantis. And by trying to convince everybody that they did come from Atlantis, the Abbé de Bourbourg really did a number on his reputation. Ignatius Donnelly is a tougher nut to crack than the Abbé de Bourbourg, though. He was really trying to bring Atlantis out of the realm of myth and into the realm of scientific fact. And the Abbé de Bourbourg was trying to do that as well, but he went off the deep end a little bit in ways that Ignatius Donnelly doesn't. Some of Donnelly's points are more convincing than others, but he never sounds like a complete crackpot in his book. He comes off as being relatively sane, so it's impossible to say how many of the people who read this book were convinced by Donnelly's research, but it does make a good case at times, and I would not be surprised if most of the people who read it were convinced to some degree. So, let me know in the comments below, do you believe in Atlantis? I'm going to say that I'm agnostic about it. I'm open to the possibility that it did exist, although if it did exist, I do not think that it was the technologically advanced global empire for which Donnelly argued in this book. I think it was much more likely to just be an island city that was flooded, and some people survived. But I do think it's entirely possible for it to have been a real place. It would not be the first time that a mythical city has been proven to be real. For centuries, people thought that the city of Troy was entirely fictional until the remains of Troy were found by Heinrich Schliemann in 1871. So if one mythical city can end up being real, why can't another? But also, the real-life Troy was nowhere near as large and powerful as mythical Troy was, and I think the same would most likely be true of Atlantis. Now, I did look on neo-Nazi TikTok, which still exists, to see if they are as interested in Atlantis as they are in Agartha, and mercifully it would appear that they are not. I think that Atlantis might just be a little bit too mainstream for them. But that does remind me of something I wanted to address. In my last video, I got several comments from people who were highly offended that I had made disparaging remarks about the neo-Nazi community. I also had several people reaching out to me on Instagram trying to convince me of the truth of the Great Replacement theory. I would like to apologize to the people whom I offended. So, sorry I triggered you, snowflakes. Maybe you should grow a thicker skin and not be so easily offended next time. And by all means, keep on leaving hate comments underneath my videos. They just push my videos up in the algorithm and make it so more people can see them. And know that I will continue to lob the harshest of criticisms at neo-Nazis and white supremacists whenever it is topical to do so, especially given the absolutely terrifying path down which my country seems to be barreling at an alarming rate. It is more important now than ever to call a spade and a Nazi a Nazi. I really hope you've enjoyed this video, and I hope I'll see you again for part 2, when we'll discuss more weird and wonderful theories, such as Lemuria and the lost continent of Mu. Thank you so much to the people who support this channel on Patreon. I am so grateful to you.